The election of 1860 was a turning point in American history, highlighting the growing sectional divide over slavery and culminating in the secession of Southern states. This pivotal election was shaped by the fractured state of the Democratic Party, the rise of the Republican Party, and the South's perception of Abraham Lincoln's presidency as a threat to its way of life. The Democratic Party entered the 1860 election deeply divided along sectional lines. Northern Democrats rallied behind Stephen A. Douglas, who championed the principle of popular sovereignty, allowing territories to decide the issue of slavery locally. However, this position alienated Southern Democrats, who demanded federal protection for slavery in the territories. The party's national convention exposed these divisions. After delegates reaffirmed Douglas's platform, approximately 50 Southern delegates walked out. In response, Southern delegates formed their own party, the Southern Rights Democratic Party, and nominated John C. Breckinridge, solidifying the split. The fragmentation of the Democrats paved the way for a four-way race. The newly formed Constitutional Union Party, composed of conservative former Whigs from both the North and South, sought to avoid the divisive slavery issue by emphasizing unity. They nominated John Bell, who had little chance of winning but acted as a stabilizing influence during the campaign. This division among Democrats and the conservative influence of Bell reshaped the electoral contest into two regional battles, Republicans versus Democrats in the North and Democrats versus Bell in the South. In contrast to the fractured Democrats, the Republican Party emerged as a cohesive force, advocating the non-extension of slavery into the territories. At their convention in Chicago, Republicans chose Abraham Lincoln over more experienced candidates like William Seward, who was seen as too radical for swing voters in key northern states. Lincoln's moderate stance, compelling personal story, and articulate opposition to slavery's expansion made him an appealing candidate to a wide spectrum of voters. The Republican platform was crafted to attract diverse northern constituencies. It included calls for excluding slavery from the territories, raising tariffs, passing a Homestead Act, and providing federal aid for internal improvements like a transcontinental railroad. This platform energized young voters and first-time participants in the North, many of whom saw the election as a decisive stand against the spread of slavery. For many Southern leaders, Lincoln's election represented a direct threat to their economic and social systems. The Republican Party's anti-slavery platform was seen as an existential danger to the institution of slavery and the Southern way of life. Southern leaders feared losing control over their political destiny and viewed Lincoln's presidency as symbolic of Northern dominance. Although Lincoln assured Southerners he would not interfere with slavery where it already existed, his opposition to its expansion was unacceptable to the South. The election results reflected these fears. Lincoln swept the North, winning every free state and securing a substantial victory in the Electoral College, despite receiving less than 40% of the popular vote. In the South, while most voters supported Breckinridge, while Bell found limited success in the Upper South. The Democratic split and Lincoln's strong Northern support ensured his victory, but further polarized the nation. Lincoln's election served as a catalyst for Southern secession. Extremist Southern leaders, known as fire eaters, argued that secession was necessary to preserve Southern sovereignty. They asserted that the states, as creators of the federal government, had the right to withdraw from the Union if their interests were threatened. Following Lincoln's victory, South Carolina became the first state to secede in December of 1860. By early 1861, 6 additional states, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, followed suit. In February 1861, representatives from these states met in Montgomery, Alabama, to establish the Confederate States of America. The Confederacy's Constitution guaranteed slavery, emphasized state sovereignty, and prohibited protective tariffs. They elected Jefferson Davis, a moderate secessionist, as their president, hoping to project unity and attract the upper Southern states, which were reluctant to secede without further provocation. Efforts to prevent disunion culminated in the Crittenden Compromise, a series of proposed constitutional amendments by Senator John J. Crittenden. These amendments aimed to protect slavery where it already existed, extend the Missouri Compromise line to the Pacific, and prevent Congress from abolishing slavery in federal territories or Washington, D.C. However, the proposal failed, largely due to Republican opposition, including Lincoln, who refused to compromise on slavery's expansion into new territories. The election of 1860 exposed the irreconcilable differences between the North and South, with Lincoln's victory serving as the tipping point for secession. The establishment of the Confederacy marked the beginning of a profound national crisis. While the Upper South hesitated to join the seceded states, the stage was set for a larger conflict that would erupt with the attack on Fort Sumter in 1861. The failure of compromise efforts to forestall secession, the outbreak of war at Fort Sumter, and the decision of border states to remain in the Union were pivotal events leading to the Civil War. These moments revealed the depth of sectional divisions and the challenges of maintaining unity in a fractured nation. Efforts to reach a compromise in the months leading up to the Civil War were hampered by political indecision and entrenched sectional differences. President James Buchanan's administration was characterized by weakness and inaction. Buchanan attempted to placate both Northern and Southern factions, but ultimately satisfied neither. His failure to take a firm stance against secession emboldened the Southern states that had already left the Union, while frustrating Northern Unionists who demanded a stronger federal response. When Abraham Lincoln delivered his inaugural address on March 4th of 1861, he sought to reassure the South that his administration would not interfere with slavery where it already existed. Lincoln reiterated his commitment to preserving the Union and emphasized that secession was both illegal and impractical. Despite his conciliatory tone, Southern leaders remained unconvinced. They viewed Lincoln's election and the Republican Party's platform as existential threats to their interests, particularly the institution of slavery. The symbolic and strategic importance of Fort Sumter, a federal fort located in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, became a flashpoint for conflict. Though South Carolina had seceded, the fort remained in Union hands, representing federal authority within Confederate territory. Tensions escalated in April 1861 when Lincoln informed South Carolina's governor that he intended to send provisions to the fort's beleaguered garrison. Lincoln emphasized that the resupply mission was not an act of aggression and that troops would only be sent in response to an attack. The Confederate government, however, interpreted Lincoln's actions as a provocation. Viewing the presence of Union forces at Fort Sumter as unacceptable, Confederate General Beauregard demanded the fort's evacuation. When Union Major Robert Anderson refused, Confederate forces bombarded Fort Sumter on April 2, 1861. After 34 hours of shelling, Anderson surrendered, marking the first military engagement of the Civil War. Lincoln's subsequent call for volunteer militias to suppress the rebellion prompted Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina to join the Confederacy, solidifying the division between North and South. The border states of Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri were crucial to the Union strategy and survival. These states, which practiced slavery but did not secede, held immense strategic importance due to their geographic location and resources. Their decision to remain in the Union was influenced by several key factors. In these states, there was a significant presence of Unionist sentiment, particularly among non-slaveholding white residents who identified more strongly with the Union than with the Confederacy. In Maryland and Kentucky, Unionists gained control of state legislatures, preventing formal secession despite considerable pro-Southern sympathies among parts of the population. Lincoln's administration played a decisive role in keeping the border states loyal. Measures included suspending habeas corpus, imposing martial law, and deploying federal troops to maintain order and counter secessionist movements. The Union's efforts to retain the border states were also shaped by their strategic importance. Losing these states would have exposed Northern Territory to Confederate attacks and weakened the Union's defensive position. For example, Kentucky's control of the Ohio River and Maryland's proximity to Washington, D.C. were critical to Union security. The secession crisis also led to the formation of West Virginia, highlighting regional divisions within states. When Virginia seceded from the Union, the northwestern counties, which had fewer economic ties to slavery and stronger cultural and economic connections to Ohio and Pennsylvania, refused to join the Confederacy. After a series of conventions, skirmishes, and referendums, these counties seceded from Virginia and were admitted to the Union as West Virginia in 1863. The failure of compromise, the attack on Fort Sumter, and the Union's retention of the border states revealed the deep divisions within the nation and the challenges of preserving unity. Buchanan's ineffectual leadership and Southern mistrust of Lincoln made compromise impossible. The Confederate bombardment of Fort Sumter forced the North and South into open conflict, while the border states' decision to remain in the Union bolstered the North's strategic position. These events set the stage for a prolonged and devastating Civil War. Confederate foreign policy, crucial for sustaining the South's war effort during the Civil War, ultimately failed to secure diplomatic recognition from European powers such as Britain and France. Despite their reliance on imported materials and the potential leverage of their cotton exports, the Confederacy's strategies fell short due to a combination of flawed assumptions, effective Union countermeasures, and the reluctance of foreign nations to intervene in the conflict. The Confederacy's King Cotton diplomacy rested on the assumption that European nations, particularly Britain and France, would support the South to safeguard their access to Southern cotton, which fueled their textile industries. At the war's outset, 3/4 of Britain's cotton supply came from the American South, leading Confederate leaders to believe this economic dependence would compel British intervention, potentially including breaking the Union blockade with their powerful navy. This strategy, however, proved fundamentally flawed. European nations had anticipated the possibility of supply disruptions and began sourcing cotton from Egypt and India. Additionally, the British government and public opinion were wary of associating with the Confederacy, especially given the South's dependence on slavery, which clashed with Britain's abolitionist stance. British leaders were also cautious about jeopardizing their relationship with the Union, particularly as the war progressed and the South's prospect of victory diminished. Other nations followed Britain's lead, withholding recognition of the Confederacy and refraining from intervention unless Southern independence seemed inevitable, a threshold the Confederacy never reached. The Union's foreign policy effectively countered Confederate efforts to gain international recognition. The Lincoln administration framed the conflict as a moral struggle against slavery, particularly after the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. This redefined the war's purpose in the eyes of European powers, making support for the Confederacy appear tantamount to endorsing slavery. Union diplomats emphasized this point in their dealings with European governments, successfully dissuading them from aligning with the South. The Union's naval blockade of Confederate ports further undermined the South's foreign policy. Initiated early in the war, the blockade aimed to cripple the Southern economy by restricting the export of cotton and the import of essential goods. Although initially hampered by a shortage of Union ships, the blockade became increasingly effective as the Union Navy grew in strength, severely limiting Confederate trade with Europe. While some Confederate vessels, known as blockade runners, managed to slip through the Union's naval cordon, their efforts were sporadic and high risk. The volume of goods transported by blockade runners was insufficient to sustain the Confederate war effort or to establish the economic leverage necessary to win foreign support. The Trent Affair, a diplomatic crisis in November 1861, briefly threatened to draw Britain into the conflict on the side of the Confederacy. A Union warship intercepted the British mail steamer Trent and removed 2 Confederate diplomats, James M. Mason and John Slidell, who were en route to Europe to seek diplomatic recognition. Britain viewed the incident as a violation of international law and a provocation against neutral shipping. Tensions ran high, with Britain preparing for possible military action. However, the Lincoln administration diffused the crisis by releasing the diplomats and issuing a conciliatory statement. The Union's careful handling of the affair preserved its diplomatic relationship with Britain and neutralized what could have been a significant victory for Confederate foreign policy. The Confederacy's failure to win diplomatic recognition from European powers was a result of flawed assumptions about King Cotton diplomacy, effective Union diplomatic and military strategies, and the reluctance of foreign nations to become entangled in a war with complex moral and political implications. The Union blockade, combined with shifting focus of the war to a fight against slavery, further isolated the Confederacy from potential allies. This diplomatic isolation was a crucial factor in the South's ultimate defeat. Abraham Lincoln's decision to issue the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 was shaped by a convergence of political, military, and moral considerations, underscoring the complex and evolving nature of the Civil War. At the start of the conflict, emancipation was a contentious and divisive issue in the North. However, as the war progressed, ending slavery began to be seen as a strategic advantage for the Union, ultimately leading Lincoln to act. As Union forces advanced into Confederate territory, many enslaved people escaped to Union lines seeking freedom. These individuals were designated as contraband, a legal status that treated them as confiscated property of the Confederacy. In March 1862, Congress forbade the return of escaped slaves to their owners, signaling a shift in federal policy. The existence of contraband camps, where former slaves sought refuge, underscored the growing link between the war and the issue of slavery. Enslaved people themselves shaped the narrative, making the conflict increasingly about freedom through their escapes and actions, challenging Union leaders to confront the institution of slavery. Lincoln faced a precarious political situation with the border states, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, which were slaveholding states that remained loyal to the Union. These states were critical for the Union's war efforts, serving as a strategic buffer zone and contributing troops and resources. Lincoln had to carefully balance his policies to avoid alienating these states and driving them into the Confederacy. This necessity delayed more radical action on slavery, even as pressure mounted from within his party. The Republican Party was not monolithic, and Lincoln faced significant pressure from its radical faction to take a stronger stance against slavery. Radical Republicans saw emancipation not only as a moral imperative, but also as a practical means of weakening the Confederate war effort. They argued that attacking the institution of slavery would deprive the South of its labor force and destabilize its economy. This factional pressure pushed Lincoln to consider bold actions that aligned with broader Republican goals. While Lincoln's primary goal at the outset of the war was to preserve the Union, his views on slavery evolved during the conflict. He increasingly recognized the moral imperative of ending slavery, though his actions were largely dictated by military and political considerations. By the time he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln framed the policy as a military necessity, a reflection of his pragmatic approach to aligning moral objectives to strategic needs. Lincoln also recognized the importance of international opinion. European powers, particularly Britain and France, had economic and political interests in the conflict. By issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln aligned the Union cause with the global movement against slavery, undercutting Confederate efforts to gain diplomatic recognition. Framing the war as a fight against slavery discouraged Britain and France, both abolitionist nations, from supporting the Confederacy, as such an alliance would be seen as endorsing slavery. The early years of the Civil War were marked by inconclusive battles and significant Union setbacks. Lincoln and his advisors viewed emancipation as a way to weaken the Confederacy by depriving it of enslaved labor, which was crucial to its war effort. Additionally, the prospect of freedom for enslaved people in the Confederate territories had the potential to incite uprisings and disrupt Southern stability. The Union victory at the Battle of Antietam in September of 1862 provided a critical opportunity. While not a decisive triumph, it was a significant strategic win that allowed Lincoln to announce the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation without appearing desperate. The announcement followed in September of 1862, with the formal proclamation taking effect on January 1, 1863. The Emancipation Proclamation declared that enslaved people in Confederate-held territory were free, transforming the nature of the war. Although it did not immediately free all enslaved individuals and exempted loyal border states, it redefined the Union's war goals, making the abolition of slavery a central aim. This shift provided a moral foundation for the Union cause and turned Union soldiers into an army of liberation. The proclamation ensured that a Union victory would mean the end of slavery, reshaping the war's meaning and legacy. Women played a multifaceted and transformative role in the Union war effort during the Civil War. Their contributions spanned medical care, industrial labor, espionage, and domestic management, reshaping societal expectations and paving the way for future advancements in women's rights. Women provided critical medical care to soldiers on the battlefield and in military hospitals. Organizations like the United States Sanitary Commission and the Women's Central Association of Relief mobilized thousands of women as nurses and caregivers. Although nursing was not a new profession for women, it lacked respect and formal recognition. The Civil War helped change this perception, with women like Clara Barton and Dorothea Dix leading efforts that professionalized and elevated the field of nursing. The departure of men to the battlefield left a labor vacuum, which women filled by stepping into roles traditionally held by men. Women worked in factories, producing munitions, uniforms, and other goods essential to the war effort. Many also entered civil service roles, taking jobs as clerks, bookkeepers, and eventually typists and telephone operators. The expansion of government bureaucracy during the war created opportunities for women, marking their increased presence in the workforce. Some women engaged in espionage and direct military service. Notable examples include Jenny Hodgers, who disguised herself as a man under the name of Albert Cashier to fight in the Union Army, and Rose O'Neal Greenhow, who served as a Confederate spy. These women took significant personal risks to contribute intelligence and serve their respective causes. On the home front, women managed farms, households, and businesses in the absence of male family members. Their efforts ensured the stability of families and communities, demonstrating resilience and resourcefulness under challenging circumstances. The Homestead Act of 1862 provided women, particularly widows, an opportunity to claim land in their own right. This legislation reflected the shifting dynamics of property ownership in the West and underscored women's expanding roles in American society. Women's efforts during the Civil War not only supported the Union war effort, but also redefined gender roles, laying the groundwork for the gradual expansion of women's rights in the decades that followed. African Americans played a vital role in the Union's success during the Civil War. From serving as soldiers and laborers to embodying the moral cause of the conflict, their contributions were instrumental in reshaping the war's purpose and outcome. The Emancipation Proclamation issued by President Abraham Lincoln in 1863 declared freedom for slaves in Confederate-held territories and opened the door for African American men to enlist in the Union Army and Navy. This pivotal decision turned the war into a fight for the abolition of slavery and mobilized African Americans to contribute directly to the Union cause. The establishment of the United States Colored Troops provided African Americans an opportunity to serve in the Union military. By the end of the war, approximately 180,000 African Americans had joined the Union Army and 18,000 served in the Navy. Many black regiments were initially relegated to labor and garrison duties, often underpaid compared to white soldiers and commanded by white officers. However, advocacy by abolitionists and the necessity of war gradually reduced some discrimination. In 1864, Congress enacted equal pay for African American soldiers, and black regiments increasingly took on combat roles. One of the most notable African American units was the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, composed of free black men and escaped slaves. Under the leadership of Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, the regiment became a symbol of African American bravery and commitment. Their assault on Fort Wagner on July 18, 1863, demonstrated extraordinary valor despite heavy casualties. Although the attack was unsuccessful, the regiment's courage earned widespread recognition and helped challenge racial prejudices about African Americans' capabilities as soldiers. The service of African American soldiers challenged prevailing stereotypes and became a powerful symbol of the fight for freedom and equality. Their contributions not only weakened the Confederacy by depleting its labor force and increasing Union strength, but also reshaped perceptions of African Americans' roles in society. Their sacrifices laid the foundation for post-war struggles for civil rights, influencing the trajectory of equality and justice in the United States. The efforts of African Americans and women during the Civil War were instrumental in shaping the Union's victory and redefining American society. Both groups contributed in ways that transcended traditional roles, leaving legacies that extended far beyond the battlefield. The Confederacy faced significant internal dissent during the Civil War, driven by economic hardship and class tensions. The Confederate economy, strained by Union blockades and the loss of agricultural labor, experienced widespread food shortages and rampant inflation. The diversion of slaves and white farm workers to the war effort further exacerbated these changes. Poorer citizens, particularly the families of non-slaveholding soldiers, suffered the most. In response, the Confederate government released emergency food stocks, and improved crops in 1863 offered temporary relief. However, economic instability and hunger persisted, fueling dissatisfaction with the Confederate leadership. The Confederate draft policies deepened class divisions and sparked widespread resentment. Exemptions for slaveholders, such as the 20 Negro Law, which allowed one white man per plantation with 20 or more slaves to avoid military service, angered non-slaveholding whites. This policy aimed to maintain agricultural production and prevent slave uprisings, especially in cases where women had to manage large plantations in their husband's absence. However, it also reinforced perceptions that the war was a rich man's war and a poor man's fight, intensifying discontent among small farmers and poorer classes. While the Union remained more politically cohesive than the Confederacy, internal divisions also emerged as the war dragged on, driven by war weariness, political opposition, and resistance to the draft. The prolonged conflict, mounting casualties, and economic pressures led to growing dissatisfaction among Northerners. Initial enthusiasm for the war waned as Union generals failed to deliver decisive victories, leaving many civilians yearning for a swift resolution. The Copperheads, a faction of Northern Democrats vocally opposed to the war, they criticized its cost in lives and resources and argued against the Union's efforts to abolish slavery, viewing such goals as unconstitutional. Concentrated in states like Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio, Copperheads pushed for a negotiated peace, further polarizing Northern politics. The Enrollment Act of 1863, which implemented the first military draft in the United States, sparked widespread resistance. Working-class individuals who could not afford to pay for substitutes protested what they saw as an unfair burden. The New York City draft riots of 1863 represented the most infamous instance of draft-related unrest. Irish-American mobs attacked draft offices, destroyed property, and lynched several African Americans, blaming them for the war and perceived job competition. Despite internal divisions, Abraham Lincoln secured re-election in 1864 by a substantial margin, thanks to a combination of military successes, political strategy, and public confidence in his leadership. Union victories in 1864 significantly bolstered Lincoln's chances for re-election. General William T. Sherman's capture of Atlanta in September revitalized Northern morale and signaled progress in the war effort. Sherman's subsequent march through Georgia devastated Confederate infrastructure and underscored the Union's dominance. General Philip Sheridan's victories in the Shenandoah Valley, including the Battle of Cedar Creek in October, further demonstrated Union strength and eliminated threats to Washington, D.C. The military triumphs of 1864 created a sense of optimism among Northerners who began to believe that Confederate defeat was imminent. This positive momentum benefited Lincoln, who was seen as a steady and capable leader guiding the nation toward victory. The Democratic Party's internal division also worked in Lincoln's favor. War Democrats supported the Union effort, while peace Democrats, or Copperheads, called for a negotiated settlement with the Confederacy. This split weakened the Democratic candidate, General George B. McClellan, and solidified Lincoln's support among those committed to Union victory. Lincoln's unwavering commitment to preserving the Union and his ability to navigate the political and military challenges of the war earned him widespread respect. His leadership symbolized stability and perseverance, qualities that resonated with voters during a time of national crisis. Lincoln won re-election with a significant margin, carrying 22 of the 25 Union states. The result reaffirmed the public's trust in his leadership and their commitment to ending the war on terms that would abolish slavery and preserve the Union. On April 9, 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, effectively ending the Civil War. Just days later, on April 14th, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer who resented Lincoln's policies towards the South. Lincoln succumbed to his injuries on April 15, 1865. Lincoln did not live to see the full realization of his efforts to unify the nation and abolish slavery. His death plunged the nation into mourning and left the immense task of reconstruction to his successors. While the Civil War was over, the challenges of rebuilding the South and addressing the legacy of slavery were only beginning, now without the steady hand of the leader who had guided the Union through its darkest hour.